Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the introductory words. Unfortunately, I had not had the pleasure to study at Stony Brook University, but I'm actually tied to the Center for Italian Studies, and in particular to Mario Mignone, because of family ties, but also because Mario, in a way, welcomed me almost every summer since I was a teen in the States, and I really felt him as a fatherly figure in a way, and I think he was, and I think I can speak also for Alessandro, someone extremely generous to younger people, to younger generations. Someone from whom I learned a lot in terms of values, not only family values, but also values such as hard work, tenacity, and I'm extremely indebted to him. And I would like also to thank all the others who then took on the role to organize this conference, including Sal Rotella, but also the other people in the organizing committee, to Joe, Donna, Annette on the more logistical part. So thank you very much for being here. The topic is slightly different from what we have seen until now. But I will try to be the least technical possible, but try to, in a way, convince you how more structural trends in the economy and the phenomena such as this transition to the knowledge economy, automation, and also patterns of income inequality are actually behind a lot of also the political patterns that we observe. When I was here the last time, I gave a presentation about job polarization, this phenomenon in which basically you see these U-shaped pattern determined by employment growth at the low-skilled and the high-skilled, and a hollowing out of middle-skill occupations. And this job polarization that in a city like London basically translates into me meeting fellow Italians that either work in finance or work in a caffè nero and nothing really in the middle, basically then translates into also political polarization. And these patterns and the causal mechanisms are not easily detectable, but I think are actually extremely interesting to investigate, not just the last years of platform economy with Uber, with Deliveroo, and the likes, but also some structural trends that have been going on since the 1980s. And I will look in particular at this relationship between what has happened to this transition to the knowledge economy that I will try to define in a few slides, and income inequality. There is a lot of talk also nowadays in the US politics and in the primaries with the candidate that will tackle this big issue of income inequality. That there are a couple of advisors, for instance, for Elizabeth Warren, that are actually working on a wealth tax. And I think the link between what we've seen in automation patterns and income inequality, I'll try to convince you that is there, and can in a way be tackled by looking at using some of the policy levers that we have in a way put off the table for a while. In countries such as where I live, for instance, UK, this is the case. So I will start by looking a bit at what was the 4D system like. We lived a golden age of capitalism from the end of World War II to the mid-1970s, where you had this very rapid expansion and falling income inequality, which were the key characteristics of this particular system. Well, first of all, mass production and consumption of standardized goods and services. You had this huge expansion of the welfare state, a bit of a Keynesian management of aggregate demand, and labor unions and collective bargaining played a key role. We then had this pattern of the industrializations. Here you have most advanced democracies between 1970 and 2006, and you can see this falling share of employment manufacturing. And this is pretty much, you can see that is homogeneous across all countries, going from Italy to the US. Now, what are instead the key features of the knowledge economy? Basically this new system that you can observe from the 1980s onwards. You have a major shift from manufacturing to services. So, as I was saying, the industrialization. At the same time, what you observe is other phenomena that are linked to this, which is there is a big complementarity out there between production and production processes between skilled, educated university graduates and new information and communication technology. So ICT, there is this big complementarity between the two. And a dramatic increase in female labor force participation. At the same time, the 1980s also saw the expansion of these mass systems of higher education. And then compared to what was happening in the 1970s, you also have a role of the labor unions and collective bargaining, which becomes extremely weakened. So in this chart, I basically show what's happening to the expansion of knowledge and employment. What you can see is from countries such as Portugal to the Netherlands, this pattern of employment in knowledge-intensive services raises from roughly, from 3% in Portugal, then it goes to 7%, and the patterns instead are much more observable than for some of the Anglo-Saxon countries that you see on the right end of the chart. Now, what are, and I think this is basically the most interesting, one of the most interesting slides, because it's basically looking at the different mechanisms behind this link between knowledge economy and income inequality. First one, that we have been told by some scholars that there is this phenomenon which is called skill bias technical change. What happens is that the ICT revolution basically increased demand a lot for university educated workers with complementary skills. Therefore, there was a rise in wage premium. The other is that we also have automation of occupations that focus on routine tasks. And the hollowing out of labor markets in the US and Europe. You have, for instance, a lot of workspaces where accountants played a key role, replaced by machines, where clerk work was replaced by machine, where you had a personal assistant for every manager, and instead now you only had one that takes, that basically manages the tasks for all of them. And therefore, these routine tasks have been highly automated. And now, in the last years, you actually have this phenomenon of superstar firms. Superstar firms, you can think of Amazon, for instance, but also Google, Alphabet, and the like. What they manage to do is that they actually, first of all, operate mainly in finance and technology, but they manage to make higher profits and pay higher wages than the less productive firms in the same industry. And then finally, there is this phenomenon of rapidly rising compensation of CEOs and top managers. Why is it the case? Well, because there is also an increasing complexity of their work, and they can therefore manage to reap the rewards of their talents by applying, by getting higher bonuses because of these increasing difficulty in the tasks being performed. Now, I was talking about knowledge employment, how the patterns have changed. Now I move to instead discuss how the evolution of top income shares since the 1980s is shown. So what you see is the top 1% in income share has increased with varying degrees among different countries. But in particular, and you can see this chart has been actually ordered according to the highest, to the ones that has the highest top 1% income share, which is the US. you can see that this pattern since the 1980s has been quite substantial for some countries and a bit less for some others. So you can see that some countries such as Denmark, Netherlands, Finland have not, so the pattern is much more subdued. Whereas for the Anglo-Saxon ones, and you can see them up there, is much more marked. Now, as I was saying, this is what happens in US, UK, and you can also remember from the previous chart that I showed that you also have UK and US in the employment chart that I was showing before, also exhibited very large increases in knowledge economy compared to the others. So you can already see a bit the link there. Of course, it's not causal, but you see that an increase in the knowledge economy has also resulted in an increase in income inequality. But what you actually see is that a country such as Netherlands saw an even larger expansion of the knowledge economy and shift towards services. But when you then look at what has happened to the top income share, top 1% income share, this has remained slightly subdued. Almost nothing has happened to. It's much more muted rise in inequality, which basically leads a bit to the puzzle of this paper that I put together with David Hope, who is at King's College London. And the puzzle is really, there is a lot out there in terms of theoretical and empirical evidence on this transition to the knowledge economy that puts upward pressure on income inequality, but how can we then account for the fact that some countries have had, some advanced democracies, managed to expand knowledge-intensive services, but at the same time maintain relatively high wage solidarity across the workforce, and I'm talking in particular about the Netherlands. Now, so our contribution, which is basically a cross-country study. So what we do is that we look in particular with a lot of European countries. That's why I was talking about in Europe. We actually look at 18 OECD countries and try to shed a bit of light on this puzzle. And just to give you a preview of the results, what I can tell you is that labor market institutions, such as, for instance, collective bargaining agreements, the role of employment protection legislation, so how easy it is to fire and hire people, but also other labor market institutions for which I will go a bit more in detail, and you can put unions also in there, can still play a key role in determining the patterns in this relationship between knowledge employment and income inequality. Now, so I'll try to prevent some of the questions. So you want to, again, have a very strong role for unions. You want to, I don't know, have a nationalization of the economy. No, that's not our point. Our point is to deal with phenomena such as platform economy, gig workers. You may want to come up with solutions that are not just market-based, but also that take into account what the governance and labor market institutions can do for this phenomenon. And there is this very interesting interaction between labor market institutions and knowledge economy that I will spare you a bit, but what the main idea is basically that labor market institutions create a sort of level playing field for everyone by putting, for instance, some higher wage floors that lead then employers to make more investments in training and technologies that are extremely complementary to low-skilled workers. And at the same time, what happens is that whenever you have unions in sectors that are not relatively known for having unions, what happens is that you increase then the likelihood of reining in the compensation of highly paid executives, and also ensure that packages are structured according to the interests of the firm as a whole and not just the management. At least that's the evidence out there. I will spare you a bit what the data we looked at entails, but basically we have a couple of dependent variables, that is income share of the top 1% and the 90-10 wage ratio, and then we look at what has happened to these share of total employment in knowledge-intensive services that I will describe in a second. And our labor market institutions are these four: wage coordination, union density, bargaining coverage. And we also control for big variables out there, such as education, financialization, globalization, and then the economy as a whole. So you have been hearing these words from me, knowledge economy, since the beginning of this presentation, and I bet that some of you are still wondering what are we talking about with this knowledge economy, and that's why I have this slide. Basically, we looked at the main sectors in an economy. I think here it's roughly 16 sectors, I think, which are the ones where ICT brings the most value-added growth, okay? So what's basically, in this case, it has been ordered to, according to the average contribution of ICT capital. And what we see is that, in a way, some of you may have already got the intuition about it, but post and telecommunications, financial intermediation, and renting of machinery and equipment and other business activities is where ICT makes the most impact, okay? It's basically, so some people have told me, yeah, but what about education? Education is knowledge economy in a way. Well, ICT plays less of a role in that, according to our definition. But it does so in these sectors that I've just shown you. In a way, you can think of also, I presented these at 3 weeks ago, and they were like, yeah, okay, but the postman is actually doing the same job that he was doing 30 years ago. Less so, in a way. You can also see how much it has changed in terms of the systems that they use and the IT equipment that they use. If you take just Amazon and the way it delivers packages across the world, there is a lot of ICT involved in that. So, I will spare you a bit what with our research design and methodology, but I will basically just show you these more intuitive tables, figures. What this figure shows basically is that we take each of these 3 labor market institutions that I was talking about: wage coordination, employment protection legislation, bargaining coverage. So wage coordination is basically, do unions basically coordinate at the level of the firm, or they do it in a centralized way? Employment protection legislation, what I was talking about before, about easiness of firing and hiring. And lastly, bargaining coverage, do these contracts that then are stipulated apply to what percentage of the workforce? You can see that if we take the max and min measures, what you see is the effect on the top income share, on the top income share of the top 1%, of a 1 percentage point increase in the share on knowledge employment. What you see is basically that these knowledge economy has major effects on inequality, but labor market institutions can really make a difference, because they can basically, in a way, mediate the effect that the knowledge economy has on inequality. And the same thing for also, if you look at the 90-10 wage ratio, whenever we have an increase in the share of knowledge employment, then the effect can be seen that if the wage coordination is at its minimum, it has a major effect on income inequality. So income inequality worsens. If instead it is at its maximum, of course it will have a limited effect. And for some cases such as EPL, whenever it is at the max of EPL, so it is extremely difficult to fire higher, which does never almost happens in the scale. It never reaches really the maximum. In no countries it happens. No country it happens. Then what you actually see is that the effect is very much diminished. So this is not to say that we have to go towards the application of super strict labor market institutions, but it is to say that whenever we play with these labor market institutions, there is some room for, in a way, ameliorating the effects that we see in income inequality patterns. So this is a bit what our contribution has been. We, in a way, go against some other literature in comparative political economy that says that labor market institutions are of no use anymore. They say that given how knowledge economy has expanded, given how inequality patterns have evolved, either you bet all your money on education or you try to tax robots. Instead, there are also other ways, which is through a new legislation or improve the legislation that can actually ameliorate things. Now, let me go to this conclusion. So we basically tried to look at the effects of expanding knowledge employment of both the top 1% and the 90-10 wage ratio. And we discovered that they are moderated by more coordinated wage bargaining, stricter employment protection legislation, and higher bargaining coverage. We also find for the 90-10 that actually union density mitigates these effects of the transition to the knowledge economy. And our research is a bit still limited in terms of delving into the underlying mechanisms, but we did a study, and that's where the contribution for the IMF comes in. We did a study for Denmark. As you know, in Denmark, there is this system which is called the flexicurity system. So at the same time, trying to create a safety net for workers, but being extremely flexible in terms of hiring, firing. And what we discover is actually that the system also in Denmark, which is seen as the benchmark, at least in Europe, should be revamped in order to account for these major structural changes in knowledge economy. By revamped, we actually mean that you should start taking into account, again, these labor market institutions that I was talking about. So a reorganization of unions to actually fit the needs of gig workers, platform economy, not have still a view of unions that it comes from the 70s. At the same time, an employment protection legislation that also covers the rights of these workers working in the knowledge-intensive services, and so on. So this is basically what we have been doing for this IMF consultation for Denmark, and I will stop here, I guess. Okay. Do we take questions now, or do we do it at the end? Okay.
Revision of the Patto Leonino or the Lion with some what about these countries, American countries, are already pushed into conditional dire straits in order to apply for debt? This is the level of macroeconomy, and at the level of microeconomy, what about the ethics of the white-collar clerk, not white-collar in the bank, that gives loans to people that he knows that they cannot pay, but the TV, the social media, the influence pushes them in that Pinocchio-like situation. Okay, so in other words, the dilemma is not so much, or not only if we have to pay debt, but to whom, and if the debts are worth it.
I'm sympathetic to that question, but I have a different question. It seems to me that you've asked your respondents to think in a sort of short-term horizon. Here's a dilemma. here are two scenarios. And the results are actually pretty predictable, especially with regard to the ideological differences. But what would have happened had you factored in a longer-term horizon? I can imagine, I'm not predicting, but I can imagine a scenario in which liberals and conservatives would be closer together in terms of the answers that they give, if they thought, for example, that they, in the short term, were
planning for poor people. So World Bank report of January, in the last 15 years, in the American real economy, the quota of profits going to the workers lowered from 65 to 58% of the product. It implies that every $100 of production, the owners, what we may call the capitalists, took $0.50 more than the year before, every year, and they do not invest anymore, do not innovate anymore. And this is related to the workers. Then the consumers, the markup has the same process. And the process is accelerating because World Bank informed us that from 1980, the markup increased 43% in real terms. I mean, it's astonishing. But what is even more interesting is that the 20% of this 43% is between 2010 and now, in 9 years, less, because the data.
So no, Alessandro, I don't have any magic solution to the Italian debt. Something that actually came to mind when you were speaking is also, I'm looking at some of the lawyers in the audience, the difference in bankruptcy law as well across the two systems. I think the idea of fresh start here in the US in particular gives this idea that, okay, it's fine to default because I'm going to have a fresh start, and then the idea of Chapter 7, Chapter 13, which is completely different instead in Europe, and something can be done about bankruptcy law in Europe, although it has a lot to do more with the private than it has with the public, but still. So let me actually start from what Stefano was asking me about brain drain. And another point that you actually mentioned yesterday when we were having another conversation is what you're studying has a lot to do also with public administration in each country. Why is it the case? Well, because as you can imagine, the legislation that governs how public administration can be hired or fired has a lot to do also with the amount of innovation that you can bring into the system. And there are countries such as Italy where this is slightly more difficult to do, and because it has major political consequences. And the idea of how do you link the brain drain perspective, well, then if a country is I start answering also Professor Stroiani's question. If a country is able to attract young talents because of their system of labor market institutions, but also because of their innovation, then they will be at the forefront of getting the best talent across Europe, for instance. And I totally agree with you that at the end it comes down to a political choice. It's true, like you can have springing innovation in a certain country because a few people met in a garage and stuff, but at the end it really becomes a political choice. And I agree with you that we have had this declining labor share and a lot of the profits going more towards the capital. And I think it has a lot to do also of how Europe versus the US are dealing also with these superstar firms. If you look at it, regulation is massively different across the two sides of the Atlantic. In this country, it's a bit less, it's a bit more difficult to go against these giants. In Europe, it was more of a political choice, and that's why we also paid in terms of hubs of innovation than one gets. But at the end, if you have the courage as a politician to to tackle this issue, you need to have the courage also to start talking about regulation, not super strict regulation, but regulation is needed. Before getting to the more technical answers to Alessandro's questions, there is the question about what kind of knowledge that was asked by Sarratella. I still remember actually Obama's words that were about you need to learn coding in schools. I think that's only a partial answer. Why? Because you can learn as much coding as you want, but then a new software comes in and you need actually to learn the coding for the new one. So teaching coding only is not the answer. And you have to bring in a lot more of interpersonal skill sets into the game. Now, one interesting aspect in the UK, I was looking at unemployment figures among young people, young graduates, and it seems that computer science graduates have actually a very high unemployment. Why is it the case? Because it actually seems that the coding when they finish their graduate, the coding then learned is already outdated for the type of skills needed by firms, and therefore there is this idea of bringing in partnerships between universities and companies a lot more, because if you develop skills that we actually don't need by the end of your studies, then it's not really worth it. So again, coding is important because it's probably also a question of mindset, but it's not fully the answer. To Alessandro's more technical questions, maybe we can talk more separately, not to bore to death with the rest of the audience with the methodology, but our definition of knowledge economy is, of course, quite peculiar, and I agree with you that levels matter a lot. But we were looking at these sectors because you take hoteling, there is still a lot of the work, a lot of the employees doing manual work, such as you don't have robots folding towels in the hotel as much as you do for other industries such as finance or post and telecommunication. So that's my main answer, and then we can talk about the specificity later about top 1%, 90-10. But it has a lot to do with the distribution that you observe in each country.
So shall we decide?
Yeah.
Okay.